Okay. Hi, everybody. Hello. Welcome to Unity at GDC 2019. My name is Alicea, and I'm an evangelist at Unity Technologies for media and entertainment. And today, I'm excited to share with you all how to use Unity's new terrain features to build beautiful worlds. Now, in this talk today, I'm going to talk about the recent terrain updates that have come out since 2018.3. And then I'll start talking about the updates that are coming up in 2019.1. But instead of just talking about these updates, I'm actually going to jump into the editor and show you how cool these tools are. And when I'm done, I'll share some upcoming features and some resources that you can reference when creating your own terrain systems. Now, out of curiosity, how many people here have used the Unity terrain system? Raise your hand. Okay, a bunch of you. All right, how many people here have used it before 2018.3? Okay, a lot of you are going to really enjoy this talk. So to recap the updates that have come out since 2018.3, really this started early in the year where we sent out a survey to our users to understand what changes they wanted to see in the Unity editor. And a resounding amount of people responded that the terrain tools were a major pain point for them. So this team decided to get to work and to make some changes that our community would love. So in 2018.3, we focused on two things: improving terrain performance and putting the power of the terrain tool in the hands of our users. Now, we built a new GPU instance renderer. Now, previously, the CPU was doing most of the work, which was, to be honest, quite inefficient. But by moving that over to the GPU, we dramatically increased performance. And it had a really bunch of nice side effects as well. So we had 100 times fewer draw calls, cluster calling, twice the amount of CPU performance, and 30 times reduced GC allocations. Now, implementations like the new per pixel normal maps make great use of this renderer. In the past, terrain normals were calculated per vertex and interpolated in between. But now we calculate normals per pixel as you sculpt, resulting in a really high definition representation of your terrain, as you can see in these images here. Now, we also added support for lightweight render pipeline and HD render pipeline shaders, and also the ability to create and connect neighboring terrains within your scene. Now, we also added two new asset types to help simplify the workflows for the terrain system: terrain layers and terrain brushes. Terrain layers are essentially ways that you can assign terrain materials independent of your terrain object. So instead of creating a terrain and adding the textures that you want to use to each terrain system every time, now you can create a single terrain layer asset and use that across multiple terrains or multiple scenes in your project. And the terrain brushes allow you to customize and refine your own custom brushes. Now, another big update that we released in 2018.3 is the ability to script your own terrain tools using our terrain tool API, which runs on an HLSL backend for brush compositing. So 2018.3 was a great step forward for the terrain system, but we wanted to keep the ball rolling. So for 2019.1, we're offering a set of terrain tools built off of the API, as well as quality of life and user experience improvements for the existing brushes. The first of these is the terrain toolbox. Now, if there's anything I wish I could show you during this talk, it's this. It's going to be ready in 2019.1, sadly not ready for GDC, but it is an amazing way to automatically create terrain systems in your Unity scene. Using the terrain toolbox user interface window, it essentially asks you a bunch of questions like how many terrain tiles you want in your scene, what height map do you want to use. So you enter your settings, you pop in a height map that you maybe created in Photoshop or generated from some map data. You hit generate, and it automatically generates a representation of your terrain like we see here. So it's a really useful tool to just get up and running and get started. Just have your terrain be created and get started to work on your game. Now, we also have some brush user experience improvements. One of the big ones is per common brush settings. So those of you who have used the terrain tool may be familiar with using multiple brushes, and if you change the size on one brush, it changes the size for them all. This could be a little bit frustrating sometimes because you had to tinker with the brush settings every time for each brush you work with. Now you can make specific settings for these brushes and change them individually without affecting the rest of the brushes in your project. So that way, if you know that, for example, you always use a brush at a certain size or a certain strength, you can keep that setting for that brush and not worry about it changing. Now we also added some settings to the brush UI to make it more similar to industry standard digital content creation tools. So if you use things like Photoshop, this might be familiar to you. We've added brush jitter, scatter, and spacing. Essentially options that let you fine-tune the controls for your brushes in your project. Jitter, for example, changes the size of your brush as you're painting to create a more natural effect. And what we also have is integration with the new Unity Shortcut Manager. So now, not only can you set up hotkeys to use with the terrain tool overall, but you can select specific hotkeys to do operations that are drilled down specifically for the brushes themselves. So you can get really customized with the hotkeys that you want to use for your terrain tool workflows and be able to work on your terrains really quickly. Now we also built a collection of brand new brushes that you can use. These are just a sampling of some of the brushes that we have, but some of my favorites include Clone. So those of you who use Photoshop, you might be familiar with the Clone stamp tool. Clone brush here is the same thing. Let's say there's an area of your terrain that you love and you just want to duplicate somewhere else. You can use the Clone stamp tool to copy it and then add it elsewhere into your terrain. The bridge brush allows you to create pathways automatically over gaps or cutting paths through mountains. And the terrace brush allows you to create cool layered effects that are good for creating things like canyons or steps and more. Now when it comes to brushes, one thing that we were really thinking about for the terrain tools is that how important it is to mimic real life physical processes by So essentially, we wanted to provide tools that can mimic real world physics like erosion. So in this case, in the real world, terrain gets worn down over time from things like wind, heat, and rain. So we've added these physical erosion brushes that can calculate erosion on your height maps and simulate how these three effects will affect your terrain. And you can get really specific with how you want to customize, for example, the wind direction and the speed and more. And as you apply that to your scene, you're able to create much more natural looking terrain when you're following kind of like the basic laws of physics. So, and this is all simulated on the GPU using a compute shader to handle all the heavy physics calculations. Now I want to jump into the editor to actually show you how cool these tools are. I have an empty editor scene here, and it's set up with some HDRP volumes and 2 directional lights. Otherwise, we're going to start making our terrain from scratch. So the first thing I'm going to do is go to my hierarchy. I'm going to right-click 3D object and create my terrain tile. So here I have the base terrain tile that I'm going to work with for this scene. And the first thing I want to do is to make this look a lot more interesting. I don't want to be sculpting just a white tile here. So I'm going to go ahead and implement our new terrain layers. So by going to my brush settings here and going to paint texture, if I scroll down to the bottom here in my inspector, I see a setting option for terrain layers. Now creating a terrain layer is very simple. Click on Edit Terrain Layers, Create Layer, and you can select any texture that you want to use in your terrain, and it automatically creates a layer asset that you can work with. In this case, I already created several layers, so I'm going to go ahead and add them to my terrain. The first one you apply gets applied to your terrain automatically. So I'm going to add some dirt and make this look more interesting. So here I have a detailed dirt texture, and what I'm also going to add is a layer for rock terrain and also snow. And you'll see how I use those other two towards the end of this. Now that I have my dirt texture here on my terrain, the next thing I want to do is raise the height of my terrain. So when you make a terrain tile, it starts at height 0. In this case, we want to bring up the height, so not only can we sculpt upwards in our terrain, but we can also sculpt down and create valleys. So if it's at height 0, I can't push it any more down. So I'm going to set the height to 150. using the height controls here in the inspector. And I'll hit flatten. And you can see that my terrain now raised. This is going to let me now create those dips and valleys as well as those mountains. And now what I want to do is just form the general shape and feel of our terrain. So I'm going to use the raise or lower terrain tool, a very familiar tool for those of us who use the terrain system. And I'm going to use my new brush settings to get really specific on how I want the terrain to start kind of raising and lowering in my scene. So in my controls, I'm going to keep my brush strength pretty low because I want to have kind of a softer effect when I'm raising my terrain. I'm going to up the jitter just a tiny bit. And I'm going to up the brush size a lot and also up the jitter for it as well. What this is going to do is that when I'm painting my terrain, it's going to vary the size of my brushes I'm painting to create a more natural feel, because nothing in nature is one single solid perfect size. There's variation, and that takes care of that for me. So now that I've set up my brush, I'm going to zoom in here and start planning out how I want to do my terrain. So, whoop. That was really strong, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce the jitter a little bit more. All right. So now I'm plotting out how I want my terrain to look. I want a couple of mountains, so I'll bring them up here. Now that I created some of the raised terrain, I'm actually going to go ahead and use one of the new shortcut manager shortcuts to invert my selection. So I'm pressing the Z key now to invert the selection, and I'm clicking and holding down to push the terrain down to create a canyon. All right. So I'll add a couple more strokes here. Bring this up a bit. All right. So now I have the base here for my terrain. So now I added these kind of like soft looking, forms and hills. But in real life, the shapes like this have a lot more detail and texture. So I'm going to show you how you can use some of these new terrain brushes to add in that detail to your terrain. So one of my favorites is under Utility, a brush called Noise Height. So if I click on this and scroll down, you'll see that I have an automatically generated randomized noise map. And so I can zoom in and out of it to kind of select the area that I want to use. And essentially, this is going to apply to my brush. And when I paint with it, it's going to be used as a mask on my terrain. So it's going to start generating that texture when I apply it right now. So let's see. I'll zoom out a bit so you can see a lot of the little detail. I'll make the brush size a bit smaller. Now if I go here to my terrain and zoom in, you'll see when I paint, now it's adding that textured effect to my terrain. So this is a really quick way to start adding those details. I can quickly zoom in and get a more kind of softer effect and apply it to the peaks here. And you can do a lot of variation. You can actually get really specific for the settings that you want for your noise map. So you can adjust the octaves, the amplitude, and more. So I'll make a couple of changes here. And you can see how this all creates different effects as we're sculpting our terrain. Now, let's say you're using a tool like like Noise Height, and you want to add you want another way to add more details. One of the things that you can do is use the Stamp Terrain brush. Now this is great because you can take a brush texture that you have, like let's say this brush I have over here. I really like this texture effect, and I want to apply that as a kind of item like terrain stamp essentially in my scene. I'm going to go ahead and go to my settings here. I'm going to set the stamp height. I'm going to turn off subtract and set the stamp height. And essentially what this is going to do is that once I set my brush settings, it's going to take that texture I have for my brush and automatically in one click let me place it in my scene. So I can go use different brushes and change specifics for them and essentially start creating some really cool effects in just one click. Now, if you're adding a lot of detail, let's say I add a lot of stamps or a lot of noise. Maybe it's too much and it doesn't look too natural because, like I was mentioning before, there's erosion in terrain that makes it look realistic. I'm going to go ahead and use one of the erosion brushes. So under simulation, wind erosion, I now have a wind erosion brush that I'll use. And if I scroll down to its settings here in the inspector, I can change the simulation scale, the wind speed, and more. But I can also use the shortcut manager to have shortcuts that do this for me. So if I press the S key, I can automatically rotate the direction of the wind as I'm painting. So I'll set the brush size. I'll lower the strength. These erosion brushes are really strong. And I'll go ahead and start painting. So now you see as I'm painting, it's eroding the appearance of all that noise and textures that I added. Now, you can basically, and a lot of the effects that I'm doing here today are really exaggerated so you could see how they look. But really, when applying all of these brushes in subtle ways, the way that they layer with each other, you can create some really gorgeous visual effects. Now, let's say I eroded too much and I want to add some of that detail back. Another cool way to do that is by using the filter contrast brush. And essentially what this does is that it highlights the kind of higher parts of the area where the brush is, and also emphasizes the lower parts as well, the dips. So basically I can kind of highlight, I'm going to lower the brush strength. I can highlight kind of like the differences here in my terrain. So there we go. Add some more detail back. And now basically, now you know and understand how to kind of create that variation that you need in your terrain. But when you're making your terrain, you're not just thinking about how nice it's going to look, you're also thinking about how your game character is going to navigate this world. So what we're going to do is I'm going to show you some of the brushes that you can use that you can keep in mind when you want to create kind of like playable areas for your characters. Underneath, let's see, sculpt, or let's see. You know what, I like the bridge tool. So here for the bridge tool, what this does is that essentially automatically creates pathways over gaps that are really useful for, let's say, when you're wanting to build like a ledge on a mountain, or you want a way for a character to be able to cross a valley. So in this case, I'm going to press I'm going to make this, my brush size a little bit smaller so my pathway isn't too big. Now I'm going to go ahead and make a path between these two mountains here. So by pressing Shift and clicking on one side, and then left clicking on the other side, it automatically generates a pathway that I can use in my scene. Now, there's lots of different ways to use the bridge tool. One of the ways I really like using it is that if I make like a mountain range and I have a lot of high terrain in my scene, I can go ahead and actually cut through the mountains and create a pathway that my character can walk through. And same kind of way, shift and click to start your starting point. I'll up the brush size a bit. And I'll click over here. And we automatically create a pathway through our scene. Now, once you do this, it's a great way to go ahead and start using your erosion brushes. So I'll use hydraulic in this case, to start eroding your materials around your pathway to make it look a lot more natural. But in this case, you guys know what I'm going for. Now, another really cool tool is the terrace tool. So if I go to artificial terrace, I love this because to me it like helps you create like really cool kind of natural looking steps, or almost like a cool temple effect. And if I, let's see, go to my terrace controls here, I can set the interior corner weight for my terrace effect. I can select the amount of terraces I want formed when I'm painting, and I can adjust the jitter as well to kind of create that variation. So I'll keep a low terrace count so it can really kind of like block out those terraces so you guys can see them. So if I scroll down here below and start painting, you see it automatically creates that cool step effect. So if I undo this and I kind of like increase the terrace amount a bit, now it's a lot softer. So this is a really cool way to kind of add more interesting variation to your scene. So now that we've kind of edited the terrain to see it kind of have the physical effects that we want it to have, I'm going to go use the paint texture tool and paint in those rock and snow layers that I created before when I added the terrain layers. So by clicking on the rock texture and going to my brush settings, I'll bring up the brush strength. In this case, brush strength, when you're using the paint terrain, paint texture option, it's like your opacity for your brush. I'll add some variation as well with the jitter and up the brush size. And I'll go ahead and start painting that rock texture here on the peaks. And I'll lower the opacity a lot more and up the brush size to kind of create some soft variations in my terrain. Now the same with the snow. I'll click on the snow here. Make the brush size a bit smaller to have a smaller surface area. And start adding, and I'll use some different textures here. And really, like, a lot of this is like, I'm showing you quickly, like, this is what we're doing in just 10 minutes. And so when you have the time to set up your own custom brushes, to really have some time to tinker with the specific settings, if you can create something that looks pretty cool like this in just 10 minutes, imagine what you can do in an hour, in a day, and more. So now you all have an idea of how the new terrain tools are working in the new updates for our terrain system. I'll go back here. And now, all right, you see it, cool. So things to note. So new brushes are arriving in 2019.1 as an asset package. So everything that you've seen is going to be coming up soon. And tentative for 2019.2 onwards, physics-based material painting. So, and also the ability to mask by slope and mask by height functionality is going to be coming in 2019.2 as well. And basically through all of this, I hope you can take away how easy it is to start creating your own terrains and also be able to use the terrain tool API to create your own custom brushes and more. There's a lot of basic brushes available right now for you all to play with on our GitHub. And keep an eye out for all the cool tools I showed coming out soon in 2019.1. But thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here today. That GitHub I mentioned, you can find the link right here. You can use it today. And the forum for world building is also an excellent reference if you have any questions about the terrain tool or want to share what you're working on and more. But thank you. If you have any questions, I'm not sure where Ali is, if I'm over time. I have time? Okay, cool. All right, so anyone have any questions? Oh, that's a microphone.
Does the cloning capability only clone topology, or does it clone topology and texture?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I'm gonna check and get back to you. So for right now, in the ways I've used it, I've only been using it for like the topology itself. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Over here? We have one over here.
Hello? Can you make tunnels, crevices, and caverns with this, or no?
Sorry, I couldn't hear.
Caves, caverns, taverns, just little pockets of like holes or whatever?
Yep. So kind of how I did like the inverse effect when I was like sculpting the terrain down. You can kind of like sculpt terrain kind of inwards a bit. But yeah, you can totally do it. Mm-hmm. Now, any other questions? Question in the back?
Are there any plans to add like a spline-based tool to create more detailed paths?
I'm having a hard time hearing.
Something where you can use a spline over top of the terrain to define a path and maybe some textures that are going along there, or?
To my knowledge, that's not being worked on right now.
Sort of following up on what that guy was asking, is any of this stuff scriptable? Like, is it scriptable?
Yeah, so using the Terrain Tool API, you can get really down into the nitty gritty and basically program how you want the shaders to be affected in the terrain. You can program your own brushes and a lot more. Anything else? Well, that's it. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you all have a great GDC.